I wanted to be a mom my entire life. As a little kid, I always dreamed of, that picture perfect family. I'd get married, I'd have a house, and then my husband and I would have several children.
I've wanted children for quite a long time. When we got married, I had this idea that we would, have 4 or 5 children, but that didn't turn out to be the case. When I found out we were pregnant for the first time, my now husband, so at the time we weren't married, met up at a park in Hamilton, and I sat him down on a picnic table and told him that I was pregnant.
So it was actually Mother's Day of 2019, and my husband at the time and I were sitting outside because it was a beautiful day, and we were having some drinks, and he looked at me and said, "Shouldn't your period have come by now?" And we were like, huh. So we scooted down to Shoppers Drug Mart and bought a test, and I, peed on the stick, and it turned out I was in fact pregnant.
He was excited, which surprised me because he comes from quite a religious family and I don't. So the idea of being pregnant before marriage was quite terrifying. But he was excited, and so therefore I hesitantly got excited.
So what happened when I lost Harrison was I started bleeding, and sometimes that is common in pregnancy. So I rushed to the emergency room, and they checked me out, and they said everything was fine, and they sent me home. And for about a week I was bleeding, and I had these intense cramps, as I would have described them. That's what I described them to my doctor as. And she sent me to a specialist who diagnosed them as round ligament pains, which is something a lot of women get during pregnancy. And I think she just assumed I was a bit of a wimp when it came to pain.
And so the pregnancy was healthy for the first little while. At my 20-week anatomy scan, I found out that our son didn't have a heartbeat. And so I had to deliver my baby the next day.
It was very strange. About 5 minutes before my family doctor called me with the results, this liquid started rushing out of me. And I asked my family doctor, I'm like, "That's great. So tell me, what is this liquid rushing out of me?" And she was like, "You need to get to the hospital immediately." So I eventually went to McMaster on a Saturday evening. I was bleeding so heavily. And within a few minutes of seeing one of their doctors there, he told me I was suffering from placental abruption, and the cramps I was experiencing were actually contractions. So I'd been contracting for over a week before anybody actually took me seriously about how I was feeling. We elected to induce labor, and I was induced at 1 a.m. and my son was born at 4:49 p.m. On my mom's birthday. Actually, they share a birthday together, and he was alive for 10 hours and 16 minutes.
I was terrified because I didn't know what to expect. At that time, I didn't know anyone else who had experienced loss, so I didn't know what it would look like to give birth to a dead baby. I didn't know anything that I would have to do with that. And also at the time, my husband wasn't there. He was actually back home in Ghana, and so I had to navigate through all of this by myself. And I remember when the nurse came in with a doctor to tell me the news, I remember just crying at the top of my lungs. And I can, to this day, even 5 or 6 years later, maybe 7 years later, I can still hear my cries echoing off the hospital walls.
Well, it's funny. Sometimes it's very easy to talk about, and sometimes it's still very difficult to talk about. It's been about 2.5 years since I lost Harrison. And it was the worst thing that has ever happened to me, without a doubt. Losing your child and having a pregnancy loss is perhaps the most isolating experience. There's a big taboo around infant and pregnancy loss, so it makes people very uncomfortable nobody really knows how to process it, especially because it goes against the natural order. You expect your grandparents to die, your parents to die, but nobody really knows what to do when you lose a child because it goes against what people, society expects. So it was very, very difficult and very isolating and very lonely.
Yeah, when we shared the news with our friends and family, everyone was quite compassionate at first. Like, a lot of our friends would like drop off meals at my house because they knew that I just was not in a place to cook and like cook for myself or even for my son at the time, because our son was just over a year old. And yeah, I felt like everyone really came around our family at the time. But after a while, that support started to drop off because people just didn't know what to do after like the immediate loss.
Everybody was very, very supportive. Our friends would and family would, check in on us. We went away for about a week just to get away. We came home and our house had been cleaned. They had cleaned up our yard and done gardening. But, very shortly, after maybe a couple of weeks, everyone else had moved on with their lives, but we hadn't. So our support really began to drop off. And, it kind of got to a point where our friends didn't necessarily want to be around us, or at least me in particular, because I was a grieving mother. I didn't know where I fit in society anymore or who I was at that point. Everyone's like, okay, yeah, you lost your son. And like let's move on, but it's very hard to move on from something like that.
Yeah, this loss caused my husband and I to grow closer in some ways, but also it was hard to communicate through the loss because everyone grieves differently. And so I was a very, I guess, like open griever where I wanted to talk about it and I talked about it with friends, and my husband was very closed off. And so it took, I held on to resentment for quite a long time, actually. And it wasn't until we started experiencing more losses that we actually started to talk about it more.
So losing our son was very difficult on our marriage. My husband and I hadn't even been married for a year yet when we lost Harrison. And initially, it made us very, very close. It pulled us together because we were in just a pit of grief together. But grief is such a unique experience, and it's very individual. So we started grieving very, very differently. And ultimately, losing our son, it broke our marriage. We ended up kind of breaking up within a few months after, and ultimately we've separated and are no longer together.
When I experienced my first loss, there was a lot of blame like towards myself. And I also wondered, like, was it something that I did? Did I drink too much coffee? Is it because, like, was I jinxed in some way because I had our first son, like, we were pregnant with him before we got married? So there's all these, like, questions that I was asking myself and blame, like, towards myself and also towards God.
I think, like most mothers, when I lost my son, because it was, an issue within my body, I felt a lot of personal blame. So it's like, my body was built to house life and to give birth to children. So I really felt like my body had let me down. And I was very hard on myself for quite a long time until I realized that it was actually not at all my fault. But it took me a very long time to come to terms with that. So when I first lost Harrison, I did not cope very well. I drank a lot, which I'm not a drinker at all. So anyone who knows me very well would be surprised to hear that I was probably drunk every day for a couple of weeks.
I mean, at the beginning, I think I numbed myself quite a bit because I didn't know how to navigate through it. So, watched a lot of mindless TV and tried to not think about it.
I smoked a lot of marijuana, just trying to numb myself from, the world. and I did not have very healthy coping mechanisms. And it wasn't until a dear friend of mine suggested that I join a support group that I finally was able to find healthy coping mechanisms and, find other people who had gone through the same, type of situation. And I realized that, I wasn't alone. I wasn't some freak of nature, that it's actually very common to suffer a pregnancy or infant loss. So
a lot of that grief that I had been suppressing finally came to the surface through a lot of anger and depression and anxiety, and I realized it was unresolved grief. So it was then that I started to talk about it more, and I've found that through talking with others who have had similar experiences has been such a healing mechanism for me.
Talking about my son is probably one of the greatest joys that I have in my life. So, sorry, I absolutely love to talk about my son. I bring him into every day with me and everything that I do. I always have a necklace that represents him in some fashion. I have quite a collection of them now. If you walk into my space, he has stuff everywhere. I talk about him with anybody who will listen. Much like parents who have living children, they love to share what their kids are up to, what they've done. I love to talk about my son. He has made me who I am, and I love talking about him with anybody who will listen, but sadly, he tends to make a lot of people uncomfortable, so I have to find the right audience.
So I've run a couple support groups online where a group of us will get together and we'll share our stories of loss. We'll, talk about what happened to us, and we'll talk about the different ways that we've been navigating through grief. Also ways that we've been dealing with it in healthy ways to get ideas from each other on how we can navigate through the grief much better.
What I would like people to know about what I've been through, for people who are going through it themselves, is that you're not alone. You are not, some abnormality. It is very common. And for people who haven't been through it, I would really like them to know that it fucking sucks. And if anybody in your life experiences a pregnancy or infant loss, don't give up on them. They do need a lot of support. And unfortunately, there isn't a lot of support for this type of loss out there. So that's what I want people to know.
I really want to let others know that, number one, if you've been through this, you are not alone, and that your feelings are valid. You are allowed to grieve. And also, I want people to know, who haven't been through this, to educate yourself. So educate yourself on different types of loss stories, what it looks like for people to navigate through this, so that you can support those people in your life who've been through loss in a much better capacity. Because I have found people get very uncomfortable with grief and they don't know what to say or what not to say. And people mean quite well, but then they end up saying things that can be quite hurtful. So our children who are not here, their names are Josiah, Jeremiah, Jordan, Jezreel. And then we call the other ones little bubs because they were quite tiny when we lost them.
My son's name is Harrison John Filkin.